So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ian Gold. He is a professor in philosophy and member of the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry at McGill University, where he holds a Canada Research Chair in Philosophy and Psychiatry. Before moving to McGill, he completed a PhD in philosophy at Princeton University and spent many years in academia in Australia, which is where I first met him. In fact, I might even venture to say that perhaps the idea that I have most personally and deeply appreciated from Ian was to hold a philosophy and neuroscience meeting on an island in the Great Barrier Reef. The best meeting I've ever been. More seriously, his current research focuses on the theory of delusion in psychiatric and neurological illness, and on reductionism in psychiatry and neuroscience. A recent theme in his research has been to understand how culture interacts with biology to produce various mental illnesses. Consequently, his interests encompass both the brain and the environment in which it is situated. And this, I suspect, is a major theme of his book, No Mind is an Island, Madness, Society, and the Limits of Neuroscience, co-written with his brother Joel Gold, and due to appear later this year, still.
I hope so.
Today, he will be talking about a slightly different topic, knowing other minds. Please join me in welcoming Ian.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you for having me. I really am honored to be here. When Chris told me who'd been at these things, from people like Ned Block to speakers today, my first thought actually was, what's happened to the standards in this place, actually? But I really am honored to be here, and it's particularly a pleasure and honor to share the stage with Yuri Buzaki, who was a teacher of mine at Rutgers many years ago, taught me everything I know about the hippocampus. He also, in one memorable class, I have to mention this, tried to convince us that there was such a thing as phantom orgasms. And at the time, I resisted. I resisted the possibility. I now believe he was right. Of course, then I was a young man and I wanted the whole package, you know. Now I just turned 50 and I'd take anything. So it is really a pleasure. Yuri is a wonderful teacher. The work I'm going to talk about, is a bit of a new endeavor for me. In fact, a very new endeavor. And so please bear with me. There's plenty of gaps and lots of weakness all over the place. But I hope it leads to some interesting discussion. So let's start with just a bit of a visual joke. If you look at the image, there's a joke there. And if we were to ask, what's the man thinking, we all have no problem immediately saying what he's thinking. We might not agree exactly, but it's pretty easy to imagine what he's thinking. Even for those of us who like to get our jokes a little more sophisticated from more sophisticated sources, if we were to ask what's he thinking, well, now it's a little harder, but we could all imagine pretty clearly what he's thinking. Now, the fact that we can do this, when you stop and think about it, right, the fact that we can do this is remarkable. We don't have any physical connection to get information directly from the minds of others. We have to make do with the relatively superficial clues that we've got, and yet we can say some pretty sophisticated things about what's going on in other people's minds based on pretty minimal cues. Now, this capacity is called these days theory of mind. It's not a particularly aptly named capacity. It's too broad. People now sometimes say mentalizing or mind reading. Again, not terribly apt terms, but I'll just use the term theory of mind. And the theory of mind really encompasses a range of things. The theory of mind is the capacity to form beliefs about anything to do with the mental states of others. Might be the feeling someone's having, the mood they're in, I would suggest something about their personality traits. I'll talk a bit about this later. But paradigmatically, theory of mind is the capacity to form beliefs about what other people intend, what other people desire, what philosophers call the propositional attitudes. The desire that something, the belief that something, the wish that something. So the paradigm case of understanding other minds is making inferences or forming beliefs about these propositional attitudes, in part because many people who work in this area think that what we want out of a theory of mind is the capacity to predict what someone's going to do. So if I know that Yuri wants a cup of coffee, and I know that he believes that the coffee is over there, I can predict that he's likely to go over there. Okay? Now, the question of how we understand other minds has been in philosophy for a long time. It was raised certainly in the 50s by Gilbert Ryle and Ludwig Wittgenstein. But it's become a scientific problem as well in recent years. In '78, primatologists began to wonder whether non-human primates have a theory of mind. I mean, you'll notice they're trying the Vulcan mind meld there, but I don't know if it's working. And that's still a matter of debate. Excuse me. And a few years ago, the whole debate was kind of re-energized with the discovery of mirror neurons. Everyone here has heard about mirror neurons. I imagine you only have to read the New York Times to know about mirror neurons. But I'll just say briefly what they are and come back to them if we have time later. So mirror neurons were discovered by a group in Parma. And they seem to be these remarkable neurons that have both what philosophers might call thick, substantive perceptual and substantive motor components. So mirror neurons fire when a monkey engages in a motor task, like reaching for a raisin. But the same neurons, the very same neurons will fire when the monkey sees another human being, in this case, do the same action. Now, why is this relevant to the theory of mind? Well, as I said a minute ago, it's a kind of a mystery how it is that we get access to other people's minds, given that we can't physically touch them. But one can begin to reason about theory of mind in the context of mirror neurons in this way. If I see you do an action, say reaching for this can, and the very same neurons respond in me that are active when I reach for the can, I can, or not me, but my brain can, as it were, search the motivations behind the action and discover that when I reach for a can, I typically intend to grab it, okay? And I can then infer that since you're doing that action, you also have the intention to grab what you're reaching for. So in virtue of mirroring your motor behavior, I get access to something much more profound, something behind your eyes, namely your intentions. Okay. Now, how do we do it? There are, broadly speaking, three approaches, really two approaches. I'll just mention the first. I'm not going to discuss it. It's sometimes called rationality theory. For anybody here who's a philosophy student or a philosopher, this is of some sort of historical interest. Rationality theory says this: when I want to know what you're going to do, or when I want to know what you're thinking, what I do is I presume that you're a rational agent, and then I make inferences about what a rational agent would do in those circumstances. This is historically important, associated with Donald Davidson and Dan Dennett. It's not a view that anyone, I don't think, takes terribly seriously these days, certainly not in cognitive neuroscience. The two main competitors for theories of theory of mind are usually called theory and simulation theory, and I may just call them TT and ST or for convenience. What does the first say? Theory says, roughly speaking, that either we're born with or we develop quite early on, probably in the first 3 or so years of our lives, a body of knowledge, something quite like a theory. It's not a consciously accessible theory, but it's a theory, a folk psychological theory about human beings and their behaviors. And the theory might contain things, principles of the sort I just mentioned, like this, pretty banal. In general, when people desire something and they typically act so as to achieve that thing, those kinds of principles. Of course, I may also accumulate information about certain kinds of people, say what your average Waterloo student does when faced with, I don't know, beer or something. Or I might even have specific information about a particular person. I know Yuri, and I know that he'll do this kind of thing in these circumstances. Now, at any rate, what theory says is that we have a body of knowledge, and we get information about what other people are doing, and then we apply this body of knowledge to make inferences about what's going on in their minds. Okay? What about simulation theory? Simulation theory says we don't need a body of knowledge to know what other people are going to do. All we have to do, or what they're thinking in effect, all we have to do is put ourselves in their shoes, ask ourselves what we would think or feel, and then infer that the other person, being sufficiently like us, probably thinks or feels the same thing. So simulation theory says we use our own cognitive mechanism to run a simulation, right? You imagine yourself in condition of somebody who you want to understand. You literally, as it were, imagine yourself in that situation. You inhibit the motor behavior, or you inhibit the consequences of putting yourself in their place, and you simply consult your mental state and then attribute it to the other person. Now, let me just be clear now, I'll say this repeatedly, but let me just be clear because people typically misunderstand this when I say it. I'm not in this talk trying to argue against theory or simulation theory in any sort of direct way. I don't have an argument against theory or simulation theory, or indeed any theory that you might have about how things work. What I want to do is I want to suggest that there's a kind of a tension in the way theory and simulation theory approach the whole problem. And I want to suggest that, not that we need to ask, whether there's a refutation of these theories, but whether we oughtn't just to start to think about the problem a little bit differently. That's all I want to do. So my aspirations here are very modest. I really just want to suggest that there might be a slightly better way of thinking of the whole problem of other minds. And here's what I have in mind. Where do theory and simulation theory come from? They come from cases where we consciously engage in a certain process of trying to understand what somebody is thinking or feeling, right? So, we know that so-and-so has just failed the exam, and this means she may not graduate. Well, but we also know she's got European plans, wants to get married, and start thinking, what is she going to do? She's got this on the one hand, she's got that on the other hand, and I have to work at it. Or maybe I say to myself, gosh, this is a terrible situation. What would I do? And I put myself in this, and I imagine, and I run the sort of a simulation. So theory and simulation theory are simply descriptions of what we consciously seem to be doing in hard cases, right? When we have trouble understanding what someone's thinking. Okay, so a case like that. The main point I want to make is the following. When we do that, we're engaging in a process that's slow, okay? So think of when you're trying to sort out what someone might be thinking in strange situations. It takes time. It's a voluntary process, right? We have to say to ourselves, let me theorize, let me reflect on, let me imagine. And it's strenuous, okay? It's hard work. We all know this. Now, that's what happens consciously in hard cases. What I'm going to say is that much of our interactions with other people and our beliefs about their mental states don't seem to be hard cases. They seem to be easy cases in a way that I'll describe shortly. Now, of course, it's perfectly possible that somehow one could translate these slow, voluntary, strenuous processes into easy ones. We'll talk a bit about that. But what I'm going to say is that if you focus on the easiness of our theory of mind capacity, if we had begun with that, rather than the consciously accessible grinding away that we do when we're struggling to understand other people, we probably wouldn't have suggested theory or simulation theory as options. I mean, it's possible, but they're not going to seem as appealing, I hope, by the end of this talk as they do now. But I have no direct argument against them. Here's what I have in mind. When you look at these people, these are somewhat exaggerated. You don't have the sensation of theorizing about what they're feeling, right? Or what they're thinking. You don't have to put yourself in their place. You know immediately, just by looking at their facial expressions and their body postures, what they're likely to be thinking or feeling. Sean Gallagher, a wonderful philosopher, makes the point this way. He says, the understanding of the other person is primarily neither theoretical nor based on an internal simulation, but is a form of embodied practice. Something that you do, like a game. In most intersubjective situations, we have a direct pragmatic understanding of another person's intentions because their intentions are explicitly expressed in their embodied action. Okay? So it does look like much, at least anecdotally, much of what we do when we think about other people's minds just happens by looking at them. So in contrast to these kind of hard cases, much of our social interaction and the beliefs about other people's mental states that are essential to those interactions seem to be very different from the hard cases, right? They seem to be, in effect, fast, they're automatic, and they seem to be effortless. And you can kind of tell a just-so story about why this might be the case, right? It's not very, you don't have to stretch. If you're doing open-heart surgery, you don't want to have to take the time and the mental energy to struggle to wonder what your nurse is thinking right now, okay, as your patient is bleeding or something. If any of you plays jazz, you know that the moment you start to wonder what the drummer is on about, you're already distracted from what you're doing, okay? So it looks like much of what we need to know about other people has to be known quickly and automatically and in an effortless way. Okay, now, to be fair, people who are interested in theory of mind are aware, of course, that some of what we do in social situations and situations involving other people's, beliefs about other people's minds is indeed automatic, okay? What they think is that what's automatic and fast are kind of building blocks of theory of mind, not theory of mind proper. You might call it proto-theory of mind or something, and I'll give you some examples in a minute. But what they think happens quickly is really fundamentally simple stuff. So here's the first example. No doubt many of you have seen this. I hope you've seen this. This is a very famous video from a paper by Hyder and Simmel in 1944. Have you all seen this? No? Okay. So this is a video. It's a bunch of shapes moving around. Okay? That's all it is. Now, the shapes start to move in this characteristic way, and what do you begin to see? What's happening here? That was not a rhetorical question. That was a genuine... You're like my students. You're like the undead. That was a genuine question. What's happening, right? There's a big triangle. It's a bit of a bully, and the triangle's bullying the smaller one, and the circle is cowering in the room, right? Maybe it's the mother and father. Maybe it's right. It's after a couple of minutes of being exposed to this, it's very hard not to see it as not just a bunch of shapes moving around, but as three agents who have some sort of mental states. Aristotle himself said, we attribute... Right, yeah. I'll let you watch it. So. There's a big finish, too, so I'll let you watch the big finish. Okay. So it looks like we automatically, or this is some evidence, right? It looks like we automatically perceive certain kinds of motion as associated with agency, right? It's just kind of something that happens to us. We don't have to interpret the emotion. We just see it as agency. So that's, of course, not theory of mind per se, although in this case we do have a feeling we know something about what the mental states of these non-mental things are, but at the very least, we interpret certain kinds of movement as associated with the kind of things in the world that probably have minds. And that's important, right? Ask yourself, how does a baby know that one kind of moving thing that makes noise is a person, and another kind of moving thing that makes noise is a television? How does a baby know that? Undoubtedly, babies do know that. So we have to have mechanisms that are probably innate that allow us to identify as salient in the world objects that are human, okay, that are agents. Here's another example. We're very, very sensitive to whether or not an object has things that look like eyes, for obvious reasons. Eyes are very important social objects. And we're also very sensitive to the direction of gaze of those eyes, probably because it's quite important, even in young babies, in fact, especially in young babies, to be able to focus attention on the thing or place that an adult is also attending to. So babies at around 8 or 9 months begin to share attention with mother, father, parent, adult, whatever it is. And the shared attention, of course, creates a social field in which the two ages, the baby and the parent, can interact with respect to an object. So now they're not interpreting each other, they're except to know that this person is interested in that thing. And that, again, that matters because if I know that you're looking over there, I can begin to think, well, what's over there that's of interest? What might you be thinking? What caused you to move your attention there? And again, I can use that information to infer what you might be, what state you might be in. Finally, and I guess most importantly, and I agree with Mike, by the way. Mike's observation that the Ekman Phases are not very good, it seems to me absolutely right. I mean, these are not the original Ekman Phases, but they're versions of it, and they're exaggerated, and they really don't, I think they capture the emotion less well. But anyhow, we have this automatic ability to look at facial expressions of basic emotions, not all emotions, and immediately know that that person is feeling a certain thing. Darwin himself proposed that there are correlations, direct correlations between basic emotions and these classical facial features, and that seems to be true. It seems to be true cross-culturally. So it doesn't matter what kind of face you're looking at. People all across cultures are able to identify these emotions in all sorts of faces. So that seems to me a genuine bit of theory of mind, right? Because if I can simply see that you're angry just by looking at you, then I know something about your mental state. And it happens quickly, automatically, and utterly effortlessly. But that's more or less where it stops. So people in theory of mind think that everything else after this, just about, has to be some form of theory or simulation. There are subtleties here I'm not going to get into. I'm totally happy to, if you have objections, I'm totally happy to discuss them in question time. But basically, I say that the rest of theory of mind, according to most of the people in the field, is some form of theorizing or simulation. Now, what I want to do for the next few minutes is give you some evidence, maybe a little bit better than anecdotes, give you some evidence that, in fact, we can do much more complicated theory of mind tasks in a way that I say is fast, automatic, effortless, and so on. So here's the first one. Just by way of introduction, you may not know this. There are these stimuli that are used very, very frequently in visual science. They were invented by a psychologist called Johansen in the 70s. They're called point light figures. Johansen was interested in understanding the perception of movement, and he got interested in the perception of human movement. And he had this idea that maybe what we were sensitive to when we watch people move is in fact relative motion. And so joint movements, he thought, might carry an awful lot of information. And to test this, he put lights on human beings, participants' joints, turned out the lights, and discovered that we can see we have a robust phenomenology of seeing shape and motion just from a handful of lights. So let me show you a couple of these, and then I'll tell you why this is relevant to what I'm talking about. Okay, so what's this person doing? You can answer, it's okay. Dancing. Okay, this one's a little harder. Catching a ball and throwing it. Boxing, okay? So if you haven't ever seen those, I hope you've gone, wow, that's so cool. We get this very, very powerful percept, even though it's clear that we're only getting a tiny bit of information. Now, not only can we get information about what people are doing, but we can get something like knowledge of their, whoops, sorry, that's the wrong one. Have a look at this one. What's he feeling? He's happy, right? I mean, it's a cliche. You can be happy without skipping, but whether or not he really is happy, it looks like we automatically want to say, it's a happy guy. Now, here's the most important one. What's this person thinking or feeling? Oh, sorry. Right? Immediately obvious. Person is waiting for someone, they're late, he's impatient, he's annoyed, he's stressed, he's pacing up and down. Okay? A second of this, with that little bit of information of biological motion, gives us quite confident feeling that we know what that person's thinking. Okay. Here's a different kind of thing. This takes a little while to explain, so bear with me, okay? This is a figure that describes an experiment, absolutely beautiful experiment done by Agnes Kovács and colleagues in Hungary. I think it was posted in Nature a couple of years ago. They were interested in the same thing I'm interested in, namely whether forming beliefs about other people's beliefs is something that we have to work at or whether it happens automatically. So here's what they did. They created a bunch of cartoon films that begin and end the same way. So at the beginning, there's a ball and an occluder, right, a little piece of wood. And the little cartoon figure I'm going to call the agent. The agent enters the scene and sees the ball and sees the occluder. And then at the end of the action, we'll get to the action in a minute, sees the occluder disappears and then the agent sees what's going on. Now there's different conditions here. Roughly speaking, there are two. In the first scene, the agent sees something happening to the ball, okay? Then, in the second set of conditions, the agent disappears, he goes away, and then at the end he comes back. Now the two rough conditions are this. He sees something happening to the ball, and when he leaves, everything stays the same. So the belief he has about the ball is true. In the second set of conditions, the third and the fourth, sorry, I should use my pointer. So in these two, he has a true belief. In these two, something happens to the ball, right? So there's the ball, and the ball leaves after the agent's gone away. So the agent believes the ball is behind the occluder, but it's not. And here, the agent sees the ball leave, and the ball comes back. So the agent believes the ball is not behind the occluder, but it is. OK. Now, the brilliant part of this experiment was that the experimenters didn't ask the participants anything about the agent. Okay? The agent is just there as part of the furniture, just happens to be an observer of this little game. The task for the participants was to pay attention to the last scene and press a button as soon as the occluder goes down and they see that there's a ball there, and press another button as soon as the occluder goes down and they see that there's no ball there. That was the task. Okay? Now, it turns out, for reasons I won't go into, largely because I don't really understand these reasons. I think this is the one flaw in this paper. People are slowest, right? The reaction time is longest when they have no belief that there's a ball behind the occluder. Okay? So when they, in effect, believe that there's no ball behind the occluder, truly believe it, it takes them the longest to say that there's no ball there. Okay? That action is the longest. So that we're going to use that as baseline. When the participant now, the observer, me, right, I'm looking for the ball. When I believe the ball is behind the occluder, I'm faster. Okay? So my reaction time is smaller when I know that there's a ball behind the occluder disappears, and I spot it. Now here's the remarkable finding. Even when I know that there isn't a ball behind the occluder, I know that the agent believes that there's a ball behind the occluder, and my awareness of his belief makes my reaction time smaller. Okay? Now notice, no attention has been called to this agent. You haven't been asked to do anything. You haven't even been asked to notice him. And yet it looks like, as soon as there's an agent in the scene, you outside the scene begin to compute the beliefs of that agent, and the beliefs of that agent actually influence what you do. Okay? Is that clear enough?
Would that mean RT is greater than baseline?
No, RT is, so baseline is the slowest. So reaction time is I beg your pardon?
Time to detect the ball.
Time to detect the ball is less when you believe there's a ball, and it's also less when you don't believe there's a ball, but you know somebody else believes there's a ball. Okay? Is that okay? Yep. They did this with adults. They also did it with 7-month-olds. Of course, the paradigm had to be a little bit different. Those of you who know how baby studies work know that you can get babies to tell you what they're thinking by how long they're looking at things. And babies seem to do the same thing as adults. So at 7 months old, babies seem to be aware of the beliefs of others, and those beliefs somehow affect their choices, their behaviors. Sorry, yeah?
Did they predict that that one would take longest?
I beg your pardon?
Did they predict beforehand that that one would take longest?
That this one would take longest?
Yeah.
They did. And they don't say why they did. And that is the flaw in this. I think the reason they say they predicted it is because that's what happened. And that, which is a very useful way to predict things. They don't offer any, they stipulate that it's obvious that having a belief that there's a ball there will make reaction time shorter. There is a potential argument they have in mind. The argument might be this. I'm in two states with respect to this ball. Either I believe that there's a ball there, or, since there's no ball there, I don't have any belief, right? So since there's nothing I can make use of, I'm going to be slow. Of course, that's not a very good argument. So I don't know what they're thinking. But I don't worry about it because I love the experiment, and so what matters is the result. And the result isn't impugned by this slightly mysterious assumption. Okay, so that looks like an automatic representation of other people's beliefs. Let me turn now to something else, which will make some contact with Mike's talk. I'm going to move to faces. And this is some work. I'm going to show you some work by Alex Todorov at Princeton. Absolutely wonderful work. Todorov's interested in how we make judgments of somebody's trustworthiness. Now, of course, someone's being trustworthy, that's a complicated thing, right? Whether you're trustworthy or not is not only a question of your psychological states, there's moral considerations involved. There's all sorts of a big mishmash of things. To really know or be confident about whether somebody's trustworthy or not, you have to know them very, very well, right? And if you're someone like me, namely someone who's a very bad judge of character, you may never really know whether someone's trustworthy or not, or never be confident that you know whether someone is trustworthy or not. And yet, in some other sense of trustworthy, we have to make automatic or quick judgments of trustworthiness all the time. Here's what you should have in mind. There's a snowstorm, you're standing at a bus, there's a whole line of people waiting for the bus isn't coming, you want to call your brother to pick you up, your cell phone is dead, right? Your battery's dead. You want to go and ask someone to borrow their cell phone. Who do you approach, right? It could be random, but I think we all probably know that it's not. What you want to do is you want to approach someone who you think is approachable, and by approachable, we mean trustworthy. For example, this is not a person who's likely to say, after you've given him back his phone, oh, by the way, that's $10, right? We want to approach someone who we have some reason to think is going to not take advantage of us. And since other people taking advantage of us is a perennial problem in our social lives, it looks like it would be good for us to have mechanisms that maybe protect us a little bit. So that's what Todorov's interested in. OK. So I'm going to show you some of his stimuli. I'm going to show you 3 faces in quick succession. You're going to see them only for a short time. So look at the fixation point. And your task is to say which of the faces is most trustworthy or approachable. OK, you ready? I don't know if this is going to work. I mean, this is supposed to be high-tech psychophysics. And it's, you never know whether it's going to work in a room like this. But have a look, OK? So here we go. 3 faces. Which is the most trustworthy? Who says the first? Who says the second? Who says the third? Right. Oh, that's a relief, OK. Now, these are, of course, artificial faces, and it's an interesting story how these faces get produced. The differences are very subtle, aren't they? I mean, the expressions on the faces are distinct, but the differences are pretty subtle. I showed you those faces for about 200 milliseconds, just because it's hard to know whether it's going to work on PowerPoint. Todorov, in proper conditions, showed his subjects these faces for 33 milliseconds and found that at 33 milliseconds, people make non-random judgments about trustworthiness. At 167 milliseconds, they're no different from the judgments they make if they're just looking at the faces for as long as they like. Moreover, you can show these faces so rapidly and with a mask that the subject has no conscious awareness of the faces, and yet you can show in their behavior that they've made a trustworthiness judgment as a function of having been exposed to it. Okay? Now, trustworthiness, that's not exactly theory of mind in the traditional sense, but to have a non-random judgment about whether somebody is trustworthy seems to me a very, very sophisticated kind of judgment about the mental states of others. OK, let me show you some work that we're doing in my lab. This is a brand new thing, and we're interested in eye regions. This is a picture from a task developed by Simon Baron-Cohen called Reading the Mind in the Eyes. And it's one of 36 pictures, each of which comes with 4 descriptors. And the task is to look at the picture for as long as you like, and then pick the descriptor that seems to be the best description of what is going on in the mind of the person with those eyes. Okay? So in this case, what's the right descriptor? Panicked, right. And indeed, as you know, I'm not going to talk about this, but as you know, you probably know that a standard view about what's wrong in people with autism is that they don't have a normal theory of mind. And indeed, people with autism don't do this task well at all. So it does seem to capture something that we think of as theory of mind. OK. So we began to wonder, even though this is quite a difficult task, because the descriptors tend to be quite complex, right? It's not just angry, surprised, fearful, and so on. They're quite complex, and you're getting relatively little information, namely the eye regions, from, by the way, lousy pictures. I don't know why they couldn't have taken better pictures. It is England, but nonetheless. So we thought, what about if we showed people the pictures very quickly? Would they be able to do the task? So I'll show you one. Have a look at the fixation point. You're going to see the eye region, and then you see the descriptors. Here we go. Okay, who says playful? Comforting, irritated, bored. Right, playful. Okay. So again, that was roughly 200 milliseconds. And this is all, by the way, this is all just pilot data. We haven't done the study properly yet. Okay, try another one. Fixation point. What's the answer? Upset. Upset, exactly. Okay. So pretty quick exposure, pretty minimal information, and yet wonderful agreement. You're a wonderful audience. I seem to I've been encountering audiences that all need to go see a neurologist lately. Okay. So here's this. This is just a series of subjects, 8 subjects, that we did in a pretty haphazard way. And as you can see, they do pretty well, right? The Baron-Cohen's mean for university students is 78% correct. And we have people one person who did better, and a bunch who did pretty reasonably close to that, and a couple of outliers. So it's clear that this task is doable, right? I like doing tasks that don't involve statistics, because I don't know any statistics. You don't need any statistics to know that this task is doable. You just did it. Okay. I know I know it's a bad thing to say, but I'm a philosopher. I'm allowed to say that. Okay. Now. Of course, as I said, the paradigm of theory of mind, the thing that we all think we all really want, is propositional attitude states. John believes that, Mary wishes that, Jane hopes that, and so on. So we wondered whether we could get people to identify those kinds of states in the same sort of paradigm. So what we did was we wrote sentences for each of Baron-Cohen's descriptors. So there's an example there. I'm going to tickle you for playful. Things will work out for you for comforting. You've asked me that already for irritated. And this documentary is so dull for bored. And we ran the experiment, again, in a very preliminary way, with the faces, the eyes shown rapidly. And now, instead of having to choose a descriptor, you have to choose the right sentence. So here, let's do a couple together. What's the answer? Right. Okay, flirtatious. The other funny thing about the reading the mind is that all the flirtatious people are women. It's odd. Okay, let's try another one. Well, just guess. Who says 1, 2, 3? Right. There you go. Okay. Now again, we did this in a kind of haphazard way. These data I'm pretty sure these data are worse than they will be when we do it properly for a bunch of reasons. It's a hard task, no question about it. People are not doing better than 50%, but they're certainly doing better than chance. So there's something there. They're detecting things. And this, again, is at 16 milliseconds. I don't actually know why I chose 60.
They could just be ruling out something, though, given the numbers you have here. And if they can just rule one of them out as not being viable, then they're going to be about 10.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. We haven't done this properly yet. So this is all just preliminary. I mean, there's also questions about what they're doing. So, you know, and we should talk about that. There's more substantive questions about what it is they're doing. I suspect, though, that they can do it. And the reason I suspect it is because I've done it, and you do get the feeling that you're picking something up. Incidentally, I don't know, we did it at 16 milliseconds just because I was feeling macho, you know, and I thought, how fast, you know, what's the refresh rate of this computer? 16 milliseconds, that's how fast we're doing it, right? And I knew that Todorov did it at 33 milliseconds. That's we should have started there. So we'll improve it. Next time I come to talk here, I'll show you proper data. But I say that people can do it. And this is the paradigm theory of mind capacity, and people are doing it on 16 millisecond exposure, and they're choosing genuine propositional attitudes. Okay, so remember where we were at. The thought was, what about theory, simulation theory? There's nothing that I say disproves them, but there is a tension. And here's the tension. It's very obvious. Theory, simulation theory are based on, rather, slow, voluntary, and strenuous processes, right? That's the phenomenology of it. Now, of course, the theory theorist and the simulation theorist says, yeah, but of course, eventually, that stuff goes in, goes inside, it's unconscious, and so on. And so it doesn't have to be fast, it doesn't have to be slow, and so on. Now, that's fine. That could very well be. I have no argument against that. Although I do think that people who say, yeah, but it's unconscious, that's not a good enough answer. Because making something unconscious doesn't ipso facto do anything to it except make it unconscious. What you have to do, if you want to say that you can take a cognitively demanding process and make it fast and effortless and so on, is you have to show me a model that will explain to me how it is that, although consciously when we do the hard reasoning, it feels slow and deliberate and so on, when you transfer it, make it unconscious, suddenly it becomes fast. We need a model. And so far as I know, no one's actually developed models specific enough to test. So it's possible, it's quite possible, that what begins as a reflection on our conscious experience of forming beliefs about other people's minds, which is slow and so on, it's possible that that is also the way we do the easy cases, but we need some models to evaluate. So there's a question mark there. And anybody who's looking for PhD thesis work, I think this would be a wonderful project. Okay. What I think this suggests, what I think the fact that, if it is a fact, that we do seem to do some pretty complicated theory of mind tasks quickly and automatically and so on, it suggests that we should maybe think about theory of mind in a slightly different way. And I'm going to just make some incredibly superficial remarks. Fortunately, Mike made some not superficial remarks, and I'm going to echo some of what he said. I'm going to suggest that some theory of mind, certainly the kind that involves recognition of mental states by looking at faces, is a kind of expertise. Okay? And what I have in mind is something very traditional. As you know, expertise is often studied in the context of chess, because chess ranks everybody, right? The moment you start playing chess, you get a ranking. And so you can actually objectively tell how expert someone is at playing chess. Now, there's lots and lots of work looking at chess masters and what makes chess masters masters. And undoubtedly, part of what makes chess masters masters is a huge amount of deliberate practice that changes the way they perceive chessboards. Okay, literally changes it. And one way it's changed is that chess masters see something like the configurations Mike was talking about, this kind of higher order perceptual object, you might call it a template or whatever, rather than the individual pieces on the individual squares. And if you do a lot of this, you begin to see these configurations as states of the whole board, and you begin to see them as kind of offering, they're affordances for choosing a move. Okay? And that's what chess masters seem to do. They look at the board and they immediately know what their options are, right? Good diagnosticians, here are 3 symptoms, they immediately know it's one of 4 things. It's not one of the 300 things you learn in first-year medicine. So one hypothesis, one possibility for theory of mind that I'd like to consider is that what we do when we look at faces over the course of a very, very long time, don't forget, right? We're doing this from the time we're born. We're not practicing deliberately, but we're getting an awful lot of practice, is we start to perceive configurations of the core features, and we start mapping them onto concepts. So the square brackets there meant to refer to playfulness as a concept, not the word playful. So that what we have in effect is a body of knowledge, right, of mappings between visual configurations and mental states. That's it, in principle. You don't need to theorize, you just have these, right, a big table that you can access very, very quickly. Now, if that's right, and if mirror neurons really have something to do with theory of mind, and nobody knows whether they do, incidentally, mirror neurons, just for those of you who might be interested, there's a lot of controversies about how to understand mirror neurons, right? It's not clear that there are mirror neurons in the way that macaques have mirror neurons in human beings. It's controversial. Meta-analysis from a few months ago showed 34 regions in the human brain that might be mirror regions. That seems like an awful lot. And if they are mirror regions, do they mirror in the same way? I mean, mirror neurons are supposed to subserve in human beings imitation, right? When I see you do a motor action, I can imitate you. But monkeys don't imitate, so they can't be, right? So there's questions about mirror neurons. But let's suppose that mirror neurons are relevant to theory of mind. It looks like this kind of vague view that I've just proposed makes a prediction. And the prediction is that, whoops, I'll back up for a sec. The prediction is that mirror neurons should have something to do with learning, right? They should have something to do, in particular, with skill learning. If recognizing faces and assigning them mental states is a skill, then mirror neurons should have something to do with skill learning. There is a tiny bit of evidence that this is right. I'll give you one example. I love this paper. It's a paper about the perception of archery. And the authors proudly say that this is the first time anyone's ever looked at the perception of professional archers. I thought they should better not have said it. So what they did was they showed two groups of participants films of professional archers arching. One group of participants were themselves professional, I don't know. Can you make money as an archer? I don't know. Expert archers. And the other group were non-archers. And then they looked at many of the mirror regions, or the putative mirror regions in the brains of the participants. And what they found is that the expert archers had much more active mirror regions. In other words, it looks like these mirror regions have something to do with the encoding of the expert motor skill that they're observing. No doubt their own expert motor skill. The really interesting finding that the authors say they didn't predict, and they don't offer to explain it, but seems to me the most tantalizing thing in the paper, is that the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex was also activated in expert archers, and that is the paradigm theory of mind mirror neuron region. Okay? So in this task, attention is focused only on the motor behavior, apparently, and the theory of mind, such as if it really is the center, the theory of mind center lights up. And so again, it's very tenuous a suggestion that maybe the theory of mind region in the mirror areas has something to do with the encoding of skill. Okay, a couple more things and I'm going to wrap up. Where do we put all of this in kind of a big picture? It's a very common idea in psychology to think that the brain often approaches problems in two broad ways. Okay? Usually called System 1, or sometimes called System 1, System 2. So this is sometimes called dual system theory. Now, System 1 and System 2 are not objects. They're not even functional objects. They're categories of things. System 1 functions, and this applies to many domains, System 1 functions are functions that happen quickly, automatically, and without a sense of voluntary control. So detecting that an object 1 is more distant, completing the phrase bread and, make a discuss face, detect hostility, answer to the question 2 and 2 is what? System 2, in contrast, seems to be slow, deliberate, strenuous, and so on, looking for a woman with white hair in a crowded room, searching your memory to identify surprising sound, maintaining a faster walking speed, monitoring the appropriateness of your behavior, and filling out a tax form. Okay. Now, the crucial thing here is that these two systems, these two types of systems in a particular domain, are focused on the very same problems. Okay? So if you're doing arithmetic, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 4 is 8, 2 times 8 is 16, 2 times 128 is, right? At that moment, it looks like your cognition is shifting from the automatic, you just know the answer, to the, wait a second, I have to think about it. That's, I say, a shift from the System 1 approach to, in this case, arithmetic, to System 2, where you have to now recruit cognitive functions that you didn't need before. Similarly, if I were to say in a very different domain, genocide is A, morally permissible, morally impermissible. Boom, right? Morally impermissible. How about this? Pushing a man off a bridge to stop its collapse and save 5 other people on the bridge is morally permissible, morally impermissible. Well, now you have to stop and think, right? There's a whole philosophical literature about this very problem. It's certainly not automatic, right? Not for philosophers. So here's an example of what looks like moral System 1. Automatic, quick, unreflective, right? You just know. as against the kind of question where you have to give it lots of thought. And there's a lot of theorizing that one could do about this sort of dual system approach. It does make sense, in some broad sense, to be able to give rule of thumb answers to problems, which you can then go back and think about when you have the time. But it's important to be able to do things quickly when you can. Okay? So, not surprisingly, you'll see that my view about theory of mind is that maybe we should give it a dual process account. That we really have two kinds of theory of mind, maybe more. One is the system one kind, where we just see the face and know that he's thinking, knowing that she's being flirtatious. We look at the eyes and say, oh, that guy's really worried about something. We look at the body posture and say, impatient, and so on. As against the case where we don't have a body of knowledge that we can appeal to in order to say what someone's thinking. And when we don't have it, we have to fall back on these slow, deliberate, effortful processes. So the take-home message then is, yes, sometimes the mental states of other people are inaccessible. Sometimes people are enigmatic. But most of the time, they're not. Yeah.
I was just wondering about, thanks for the talk, really
Pleasure.
Just wondering about the role of agency and the two systems. So you attributed, I guess, citing Kahneman, agency or the feeling of agency to the more effortful system, whereas I'm thinking now of Haggard et al. When they talk about intentional binding. That's relatively newish research. I was just wondering if you've heard of it. Okay, so
I haven't.
What's interesting about this research is that it appears as though there is some kind of fast connection that people can intuit when they develop a kind of sense of ownership over their actions.
Yes, okay. That's actually of interest to me because I think that those kinds of issues are relevant in delusions, in fact. And this is not an uncommon idea. People with schizophrenia often lose the sense of ownership of their actions. And one possibility is that when they do that, they develop the delusion of control, namely that somebody else is controlling their action. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the case of schizophrenia is a good example. As soon as you have to reflect on the question of, is this my thought, is this my action, you're going to be incapable of interacting with other people. And indeed, that's what happens in the case of schizophrenia. I think it's quite possible that the social isolation that people with schizophrenia experience is not actually a symptom of the disorder. It's a consequence of being not at home anymore in the social world. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I have no doubt. I haven't really begun to think about how to look at it, but absolutely, no doubt. I think there's probably even other perceptual systems that we're going to be. I mean, I suspect that feeling someone touch you in a certain way will give you some clue. I mean, just think back, right, to those cases when you were living with your parents or when you were sharing an apartment with roommates, and you walk into a room and you just immediately know that something's not right here. Now, I mean, it's not magic. There's got to be some way to do it. So that's what I think we were doing. Yeah.
Oh, I wrote this question down earlier, but I'm kind of feeling weird about asking it since you debunked mirror neurons.
No, I didn't. Sorry, I didn't mean to debunk it. I'm not expert enough to debunk them, but.
Anyway, I was wondering when you put up those videos of the dots on people's limbs. Do mirror neurons fire when we see really simplistic representations of action? They
do. I mean, so I'm certainly not the first person by a long way, but the 500th person to think about, to use these stimuli to ask about emotions, for example. Ralph Adolph's, a hero of mine, has done lovely work looking at the perception of emotions. Tony Atkinson has done similar things. I don't know that anyone's done it for these more complicated things, like someone believes that his partner is late and he's annoyed with her or something. But yeah, mirror neurons are definitely responsive. It's a complicated story. I mean, a lot of the studies of mirror neurons are I was surprised when I encountered them, because the story about mirror neurons is supposed to be that mirror neurons are these unique neurons that are both perceptual and motor, but many of the tasks that are used to identify functional areas of mirror system in humans are just perceptual. So, I mean, often perceptual, perceiving a motor task, but just don't seem to address the question of whether this is a mirror neuron or not. So there are some complexities, right? I mean, so they may be very interesting neurons. I mean, I like them. They're nice. But whether they're genuinely mirror neurons is an open question. Mike?
So I wonder if you're, oh, by the way, chess experts do retweet the FFA as well.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So I wonder if you're burdening your whole argument by even worrying about theory of mind. Psychologists tend to create these high-level constructs, which could often be just a set of competencies we have, which are useful for analyzing behavior, but aren't necessarily meaningful when you get down to it. So in some ways, when you bring it back to trying to relate it to dorsal medial whatever, and then the mirror neurons, and it's like you're stretching where you don't need to. Why can't you just say, look, there's a lot of things which involve understanding the states of others, which are mapped directly from some kind of perceptual representation to that concept. And therefore, we have those competencies.
Right.
And theory of mind is a nice way of describing that body of things, but to hell with mirror neurons or the rest of that crap.
Listen, I love it. I couldn't agree more. The reason I'm engaging is because I am trying to affect a debate. And so I'm taking the debate on its own terms. I mean, there is a lot of ink being spilled about theory of mind. By the way, one of the things that I really love what you just said is that one advantage you'd immediately get by addressing it that way is we could start asking, listen, is it the same thing to know what mood someone's in as to know what desire they're experiencing? I mean, there's just a huge range of things that aren't distinguished. And I have to confess, I think that the origin of much of this confusion comes from the philosophical literature. And what's surprising to me is that cognitive neuroscientists are simply taking up what I think is some confusion in the philosophical literature. And so I think we would do, I mean, I think we would do well to disconnect ourselves from it.
Yeah, I totally, yeah. We can talk about the history of why that's true.
Yeah. Yeah, I chose the moral example for two reasons. One is that I had a wonderful PhD student who wrote her philosophy thesis developing a dual system theory of moral judgments in response to Josh Green's work and Moll and those people who think that the neuroscience of moral decision making shows that there are these two systems, and some people think they correlate with Humean and Kantian moral, it's crazy. But anyhow, but there do look to be these two functional neural systems. I think the answer to your question, and this is really just off the cuff, is that built into the notion of moral judgment is the notion that they're contentious, right? If something is not contentious, then it's barely moral. So of course genocide, in a certain sense, I mean it's moral, of course it's moral, but it's so extreme that it's not contentious. But there's very little in judgments we make about normative matters that doesn't have built into it contentiousness. So I think that most of moral judgments, as it were, asks for system 2 treatment simply because that's the nature of a moral matter. It's a matter that calls for reflection. I don't know if that you don't look satisfied.
No, I mean, it seems like that's sort of, you've now made it, so what is it that evokes this sense of contentiousness? I mean, what do you think, is there some way you could make more objective, the criterion that should evoke, us to feel that something is contentious and therefore use the second?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, I actually think that some of that is just a cultural phenomenon, right? I think that we are taught to treat certain kinds of questions in a certain kind of way. I think there's a second thing, which is, but of course this is not a good explanation, but in the case of people who have ever reflected on a moral matter, and in some sense we've all reflected on some moral matter or other, no matter how minor, you immediately are thrown back on the fact that you don't know where to look for data, right? You don't know where to look to begin to think about it. And you notice you need a principle. And principles are big, abstract, complicated things. I mean, it just looks like it's in the nature of the question that with the exception of the kind of rules of thumb your mother teaches you, don't steal, don't commit genocide, that kind of thing, we just don't have a body of knowledge to rely on for most of the ordinary cases. But look, I mean, this is all just off the cuff. I really don't know. I mean, my student Jill Craigie, who developed this wonderful idea, was much more interested in reinterpreting the moral brain sort of literature to show that there was a more natural interpretation of what people like Josh Green are finding. And I think she's right about that. How it's going to work for the actual sort of phenomenology of moral decision making, I really don't know. Yeah.
Now, I'm only a software engineer, but you've actually pulled a really interesting argument out of
I've just gone in my head and actually related this to processor design when, you know, the processor needs information. First it looks at a cache, fast memory,
Right.
and if it isn't there, then it has to go to the slower memory and pull that. Is it possible that the same sort of thing is happening with the fast and the slow system? For example, you know, I want to do 2 times 16,384. I've seen that before, I know it's 32,768. But bigger numbers than that, could it be possible that I go to the fast system, try and resolve it, it isn't there, and that's what tells me to use my slow system? Could that?
I think it's a wonderful analogy. I suspect that that is what happens. Given that the fast system is fast, it can't hurt to give it a go. Moreover, I suspect, and I'm sure there's, I just don't know this literature, but in a particular context, a certain body of knowledge is going to get activated in preparation for dealing with certain sorts of questions. So I suspect that on your analogy, part of what happens in a certain context is I load up, right, short-term memory with some things that I suspect I'm going to want to consult. I try it, and if I can't, then I'm forced on the slow system. Yeah, I'm gonna steal that analogy. Yeah, absolutely. So when I was thinking about this, the Milner-Goodale visual theory is for me the paradigm of this, right? I mean, I don't know that they describe it in quite this way.
This distinction there isn't fast and slow.
Yeah, no, I know. So I know there's a, yeah, no, I know. I mean, the reason I think of it as the paradigm, let me admit something. So I'm coming from a view about behavior that is usually called situated cognition, right? So this is a very popular thing now. It's very hip. So you know that I'm hip. And one of the principles of situated cognition is that perception and cognition is for action. So I think of Milner and Goodale as in that spirit that the system one may not be fast, but that system one is there to go from the environment directly to action, right? So that you can do what you need to do without having to reflect on the particular properties of the scene. And so I think of that as a kind of paradigm, and it's the same thing that I think is going on here. So incidentally, I mean, one of the things to say about that is, so I suspect that much of what we do in theory of mind is going to turn out to be unconscious. So when we start using masks to cover up the stimuli and we get people to make guesses, I suspect they're going to be able to do that too. Yeah.
This is related to all the 3 last questions. So there's one viewpoint from Peter Diane. So he associated the model-based learning with the one system and the model-free learning with the other one. And
right.
I think the model-based learning is exactly just like some simulated theory. So in his view, the transition between these two are modulated by experience. So I want to ask, like especially in developmental study, is there any transition between these two systems? Like for one question, is there any transition?
That's a great question. So the answer is I don't know. When this started being looked at in the late 80s, what people found, do we have a few minutes? Yeah. Let me see if I can.
There's nothing to drink until 4:15.
Oh, okay, so I'll talk slow. So some of you probably have seen this. In response to this question of whether chimpanzees had a theory of mind, a bunch of people started to say, well, what kind of, in fact, philosophers started to ask, what kind of test would you need in order to know whether someone had a theory of mind? And independently, Dan Dennett, Gil Harman came up with the idea of a false belief task. And then that false belief task was actually developed as an experimental paradigm by Baron Cohen, Leslie, and Frith. And they used it in kids with autism. Here's the paradigm. This is Sally and this is Anne. This is called the Sally-Anne task. Sally has a basket and Anne has a box. Sally puts the ball in the basket and then she leaves. And then Anne moves the ball from the basket to the box, and then Sally comes back. And their question is, where is Sally going to think the ball is? Okay? Now, when they did this, what they found was that 3-year-olds say that Sally is going to think the ball is in the box. Why? Because the 3-year-old knows the ball is in the box. And the 3-year-old can't yet understand that somebody else has a different body of information that they have to base their guess on, okay? So what they found was that at 3, kids can't do this. At 4, they can do it. And so there's a kind of Piagetian transition between 3 and 4. And what they found, crucially, this is a very famous result, is that although kids with Down syndrome can do it, it's not a general intelligence problem, kids with autism can't do it. Now, this has subsequently become very controversial for a couple of reasons. One is that a few years ago, one of my colleagues, Chris Anishi, and her group, showed that kids at 15 months old can do the false belief task, adapted for babies. So it looks like, assuming that this continues to be replicated, it can't be that 3 and 4 is the transition, because 15-month-olds can do it. And I showed you an experiment, a very complicated experiment, where 7-month-old could do it. The other thing that's become clear about this task is that it's a cognitively demanding task. You have to keep a story in mind, and you have to juggle a whole bunch of things. And a number of people have designed simplified versions of this task, and they found that kids with autism can do them. So it may be that there's a confound here, and it's not a theory of mind task, it's just a complicated task. So people do think that there's some point at which something like this emerges into, cognition, but so far we haven't, we may just not have thought of the right tasks to explore it in very young children. So maybe there's just something we're born with. By the way, I suspect that probably we are born with some very fundamental, however basic, theory of mind. Otherwise, I don't believe, for example, having looked in my baby's eyes, I don't believe that my baby was interested in my face because he's interested in eyes, right? And I happen to have some. He was interested in me as a person. I'm sure about that. And so, I don't just mean me. I'm sure your babies are interested in you too.
By making that claim. Because
why is that?
The point is that there's simple perceptual templates that can be competencies that can look like theories of mind that orient you without you having to
Sure. I don't say my baby knows that I'm panic-stricken. My baby is interested in me. See, here's the thing that nobody talks about in theory of mind. This is a philosophical problem. It seems to me, before you can even begin to ask what's going on in Mike's mind now, right? Isn't it remarkable that I know from a very early age that you have a mind? How do I even know that, right? This is a famous problem in philosophy, right? It's called the other minds problem. It's a skeptical problem, according to which, for all I know, you're just a bunch of robots. How do I know you're not? And the answer is I don't, right? I simply assume that you're not. Now, before I can wonder what's going on in your mind, I have to have the concept of having a mind. I don't know how we could ever bootstrap our way to that. I think that's something that we're born with. So it's in that sense of theory of mind that I'm aware that you are a special entity that exists behind your eyes, right? That's what I think we're born with.
So that may be the causal animacy story, really.
Yeah, I think if you don't have something like that, it's hard to see how you could begin to get the kind of expertise.
Kids attribute to more than people. They attribute to almost any animate object.
No, it's true, but
Or causal object.
well, right. There's levels here, but I guess I assert that that kids do treat adult faces as more than of interest. Right? They categorize them as a very special type of thing.
But there's a whole literature on that by Mark Johnson. It suggests that there's really just a very simple subcortical mechanism that's oriented them towards faces at a very young age. It's template driven. There's an Italian group that shows it's actually very much just a high contrast band in one part of the visual field, and that's getting them oriented.
But that's consistent, right? That could be an explanation of why it is that faces are special, right? The fact that there's a simple mechanism in subcortical doesn't tell us anything, right, about the significance of it. Incidentally, I think it's also perfectly okay to think, look, sure, maybe at initially 10 minutes old or something, right, you're just interested in faces. Even at 10 minutes though, right, you're doing imitation. Babies don't imitate moving objects in the way they imitate faces, right? You can stick your tongue out. We should talk more about this, but I suspect that even if part of the way in which mechanically, as it were, or mechanistically, we attend to faces, I think that somewhere in there has got to be a proto-belief about what kind of object this is. Otherwise, you wouldn't pay attention in the way that you have to in order to get interested in the social world. That's what I think.
So thank you very much. Just quick reminders about what's happening next.
Thank you.
So now there's going to be some drinks over in PAS 2464, which is the CTN room, and I think what I'll do is I'll give each of the speakers 5 drink tickets, and if you ask them a really good question, they can give you a drink ticket. All right, so then that'll be a sort of a surprise. Or you can give out however you want, of course, but that's just a suggestion. In any case, I also just remind you, for graduate students, if you're interested, Afterwards, in the green room at the grad house, there's going to be a meeting of the Cognitive Science Association. And you've already done this, but let's thank our speakers one more time.
Thank you.